Welcome to this session of Family Communication. This is the first of 3 sessions in which we'll be talking about the research on how conflict occurs between husbands and wives, between parents and children, and how all of this conflict affects marital satisfaction and family dynamics. It makes sense to say that conflict is perhaps one of the most important communicative dimensions of marriages. In fact, there's much research that finds that how couples manage conflict is perhaps the most important of all the communicative aspects of a marriage. And so, it comes as no surprise that a significant amount of time and effort has been spent researching marital conflict. In this session, we'll begin with a few caveats because we have to understand exactly what we'll be talking about in this and the following 2 sessions pertaining to marital conflict. First of all, you have to understand that we are only talking about research that specifically addresses how husbands and wives or other family members engage in conflict. What we will not be talking about is the broader research into how interpersonal conflict works. I teach an entire class called Interpersonal Communication, a portion of which addresses that broader research. And so in this session, and in fact in this entire class, we'll focus specifically on the research pertaining to families and how they communicate. A second caveat is simply this. I've said previously that this is not a self-help class. And so when we talk about this research on conflict in a marital setting, I'm not going to suggest the 5 things to do to make your marriage conflict work better. It doesn't work like that in this class. It's true, the research findings we will talk about do suggest what one ought to do in order to better manage conflict. Or the research we talk about might suggest what people should avoid in order to have marital conflict dissipate. But generally speaking, this is a review of what the research says about the nature and the impacts of conflict on spouses and on other family members. And so if you're looking for advice about what to do, you'll have to tease that out from the research findings we will talk about. And then finally, the last caveat reminds you that there is always this tension between universality and idiosyncrasy. We've said before that the research tells us that there are some universals specific to how families communicate. So, for instance, we know a fair bit about the conflict styles that husbands and wives adopt as they engage in family conflict. But at the same time, each person is different. Each marriage is different. And so idiosyncratically, you have to allow for these differences. What is said about one particular aspect of the research may or may not be applicable in your situation or in the situation of a given individual. So having said that, let's begin by exploring what we know about the nature of conflict in a family setting. It probably comes as no surprise that conflict is quite regular, even in the happiest of marriages. Research finds that up to 80% of all married couples, regardless of how long they've been married, regardless of where they live or their race, their ethnicity, whatever, about 8 in 10 couples say they experience at least one significant marital conflict each month. Now, of course, what counts as a significant conflict might vary from one person to the next, but the general notion is that some sort of conflict is a fairly regular pattern of marital relationships. Interestingly, about 6% of all married couples will say they have at least one conflict once a week. So just from those 2 numbers, you can see that while regular and quite common, conflict between spouses is not necessarily the kind of thing that permeates most marriages. Of course, there are some marriages where conflict is a regular part of the marriage, on a daily, if not weekly, basis. Those marriages are, in a sense, outliers. Those are the ones that have a lot of other things dysfunctional about them beyond the mere presence of conflict. We won't really be talking about those a great deal, because already in this class, we've talked about the research on communication in distressed marriages, plus several other concepts that speak into the relative health of any marriage. So instead, we'll focus on marital conflict and how all of that works out. So when spouses are involved in conflict, what are they arguing about? Well, research finds that there are some common topics across different marriages. For example, most marriages will have conflict regarding in-law relationships. They'll have conflict regarding money and sex. They'll have conflicts about parenting and even conflicts about jealousy. And so while there are some common topics, most of those topics really are more specific to the kinds of things that naturally occur in any marital relationship. So for example, it is quite common for people to have some kind of friction, if not out-and-out conflict, over relationship with the in-laws. Well, that just comes with the territory of being married. Similarly, since many families choose to have children, it's inevitable that there will be conflict regarding kids or parenting or discipline. And so the mere fact of being married almost ensures that there will be conflicts of some type. And if any overarching observation could be made, it would be this. It's not the presence of conflict that matters, it's how the conflict is handled, and it's what else is going on in the larger picture of the marital relationship. Or to put it differently, conflict is an important part of any marriage's marital satisfaction, and even a large part, but it is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of a marital relationship. Having said that, let's talk specifically about some research that tries to explain marital conflict as a unique kind of a thing. Nathan Feldman is a researcher who offers what he calls a cyclical view of marital conflict. For Feldman, it's quite natural for husbands and wives to be closer to one another or farther apart from one another. You might feel especially close to your spouse on a Tuesday, but feel less close to your spouse by Thursday. For Feldman, there's this natural cycle of being together and then feeling more apart, and then feeling closer together, and then feeling further apart. For Feldman, this is a natural byproduct of a marital relationship. Because you spend so much time with that person, because your lives are so interwoven with one another, it's natural for people to feel closer and then to feel farther apart. Feldman believes that conflict comes into this natural cycle of togetherness and separateness because if one spouse begins to feel a greater sense of separateness, the other spouse might do something that causes conflict because that spouse is trying to regain that sense of connection, that sense of togetherness. But it may well be that as that spouse pulls apart, that itself creates conflict of some kind. And so Feldman wants us to open up our eyes to the possibility that conflict between spouses might not just be about a particular topic, like sex or about in-law relationships, but instead that might also be the product of the underlying dynamic of togetherness and separateness. And so, for Feldman, there's a bit of a cycle to all of this. A second explanation for conflict between husbands and wives comes from Kathleen Galvin. She offers what's called a relational, rational view. Galvin believes that spouses are rational people that make decisions logically based upon the assessment of rewards and costs, positive consequences and negative consequences. You might recall that several sessions ago we talked about broad lenses through which to see family communication, and one of those lenses was this lens that looks at costs and benefits, rewards and detriments. And so similarly here, Galvin believes that oftentimes people will take a little bit of a tiff and blow it up into a full-blown conflict if they perceive that the rewards outweigh the costs. Or conversely, a husband and wife might not develop a full-blown conflict over a particular topic because one or both of them rationally perceive that doing so doesn't benefit anyone. And so they put the brakes on the conflict before it happens. Oftentimes it's said that one piece of marital advice that everyone can benefit from is to learn when to hold your tongue. Well, the notion of holding your tongue means you might want to say something or do something, but you choose in the moment not to do so. That reflects this rational view that Kathleen Galvin is talking about. So for Galvin, we can understand marital conflict as being a product of these choices, these in-the-moment decisions that husbands and wives make, which then either leads to conflict or steers them away from conflict. A third way to look at marital communication is from Barbara Maxwell. Barbara Maxwell offers what we call a responsorial view. The idea of a responsorial view is that it centers on responses. For her, the idea is that marital conflict occurs when one person responds in an unhelpful manner to the way that someone else has communicated to them. Now, we'll give greater voice to this idea of back and forth exchanges between people in just a moment. But for now, grab a hold of the idea that for Maxwell, what makes something into a conflict is because someone responds in a way that is not helpful. Now, those responses might, as Kathleen Galvin suggests, be the product of rational thought. Someone chooses to respond, for example, in a negative or a helpful way, and so that negative or helpful response then impacts the conflict, or lack thereof. But yet at the same time, Maxwell believes that many of these responses are not rational. It's not like we choose them. Instead, they just happen, either because we're worked up emotionally, or because it's our habit, or because in the moment we just get carried away. So for instance, If a husband and wife are arguing about relationship with the in-laws, and for example, whether they should spend the upcoming weekend with the in-laws or not, it might be that the husband who's pushing back against the idea of visiting the in-laws says something. Now, it's a sharp kind of cutting remark along the lines of, "You always did value your parents more than me." Well, if the wife responds with a defensive comment, then that means that the husband is likely to respond with something else of his own. Might be a helpful or an unhelpful comment. But for Barbara Maxwell, the key to understanding this conflict is to understand that it escalated because of the responses, or it took on a negative tone because of the responses. Or alternatively, it was diffused and became not much of an argument whatsoever because of a positive response. For example, the husband might say, "Yeah, I probably made too much of a big deal out of that. Let's just go visit your folks." So that kind of a diffusing response means there won't be a conflict. Anyway, the point of the matter is that for Barbara Maxwell, the key to understanding conflict between spouses is to ask, what's the response? A fourth way of looking at conflict between husbands and wives comes from researcher Aaron Giles. Giles believes that emotions play the most important part in determining whether or not there's conflict between husbands and wives. More specifically, Giles believes that there's an emotional environment that both spouses participate in immediately before and then during a conflict. So let's say, for example, that a wife gets home from work and she's deeply frustrated because she's been overlooked for a promotion. Emotionally, she's upset. She's frustrated, she's angry, and frankly, a little bit bitter at her boss. So she comes home. Her husband has gotten home earlier than she has, and he had a relatively good day at work. Got a lot done, in fact, earned a mark of praise from his supervisor. So into that context, comes this exchange between the husband and the wife. The husband says, "Hey, let's go out to eat tonight." The wife says, "I'm just tired to go out to eat. I really don't want to do that. I just don't feel like it." And he says, "Oh, come on. You don't want to do that now, but it'll be fine once we get out to the restaurant." And the wife says, "Don't you hear me? I don't want to go out. I just want to make some spaghetti and vegetate in front of the TV." To which the husband says, "Okay, sorry, didn't mean to be all upset." Conflict ensues. So for Giles, the key to this is not the responses, although you could choose to look at that. The key is not to look at the rational choices that are made, although you could look at that. Instead, another way to look at this is to recognize that emotionally, the wife was in a frame of mind that she was likely to transfer the feelings of anger and frustration from her work environment to her home environment. In a similar fashion, the husband, being in a more positive emotional frame, can't understand why his wife is reacting as she is because he thinks that she should be in as good of an emotional frame as he is. The point, of course, is that for Giles, you want to focus on the emotions to better understand what's going on in the conflict. And then finally, there is Mark Knapp. Knapp's fifth view of all of this is to talk about thresholds. It's what might be called a threshold view of interpersonal conflict. For Knapp, you have to recognize that a conflict might be this significant, but before you get to that level, there might be, let's call it friction. And below that, you might call it tension. And so for Knapp, each individual has his or her own threshold that once you pass that line, now you've got a particular conflict. And so Knapp argues, for example, some people have rather high conflict thresholds. They can put up with a lot before they're pushed into a conflict. Or a lot of things can unfold before the conflict turns particularly nasty. Other people have a lower conflict threshold. They don't put up with as much, or they are more easily pushed into a more significant kind of conflict with respect to intensity or nastiness. And so for Knapp, the key to understanding conflict is to see how a particular conflict episode does or does not meet the threshold that people feel will trigger that kind of a conflict. Obviously, Knapp's research would point us toward the idea that people that have a higher conflict threshold tend to have more satisfying marriages because they have less frequent and less intense conflict. Or to put it differently, it takes more to get those couples to a point of significant detriment than it might couples who have a lower conflict threshold. So, whether it's thresholds or emotions or rational choices, any of the five we talked about, those become basic background ways of understanding conflict between husbands and wives. Now, research also has been able to identify a number of other dimensions of marital conflict. Dimensions of marital conflict, as it's used here, simply refers to this general idea that there are certain aspects of conflict that have to be taken into consideration in order to properly understand how marital conflict might work. So one of those dimensions of conflict are what are called reciprocation patterns. A moment ago, we mentioned Barbara Maxwell's idea that you focus on the responses that people make in a particular episode, and that those responses determine whether the conflict is significant or not. Well, those responses really are illustrations of what we call reciprocation patterns. Reciprocation patterns are what you say in response to what someone did for you. So, for example, if I make a sarcastic comment to you and you make a sarcastic comment back, we have a reciprocation pattern. I've been given back to me what I gave you, and vice versa. And so, as you might imagine, there's a great deal of research that finds that reciprocation patterns, whether they be positive or negative, can in fact have significant influence on the dimension, the frequency, and the intensity of a particular conflict. The key to understanding this is to recognize that married couples will fall into a pattern of certain kinds of habits. In this case, the habit is one of a positive or a negative reciprocation pattern. Go back to the husband and wife that are arguing about whether they should go and spend the weekend with the in-laws. If the husband responds with a defensive kind of a comment and the wife responds back with a defensive kind of a comment, we have a negative reciprocation pattern. If, for example, there's a defensive comment made by a defensive comment, followed by criticism, and then a counter criticism, we have a twofold or a twice pattern of negative reciprocity. As you might imagine, there's a lot of research that finds that the more commonly a couple has a series of negative reciprocity patterns, the more likely it is that that's going to be an unsatisfied marriage. Or to put it differently, with respect to interpersonal conflict, one of the worst things that spouses can do is fall into a pattern of negative reciprocation patterns. So what are these negative reciprocation patterns? Well, I've given voice to a couple of them. Defensiveness, or criticism are two of the most common patterns. The wife says something critical of the husband fires back with something critical about the wife. Or a complaint, counter-complaint. Husband complains about the wife not taking the trash out. The wife complains about the husband not putting the dishes in the dishwasher. Complaint, counter-complaint. Or if the husband attacks the wife attacks the husband. So if the husband, for example, questions the wife's judgment, the wife might fire back by questioning the husband's judgment. The key to a reciprocation pattern really is twofold. First of all, there is a certain kind of communication that is responded to with an identical or nearly similar kind of communication. And second of all, there is a recurring pattern of behavior in which this type of thing occurs on a rather regular basis. Or to put it differently, this hypothetical husband and wife often, on different topics, at different times, fall into this pattern of criticism, or complaint, counter-complaint. The final of the most common types of negative patterns is what's called complaint justification. It's where a wife will complain, for instance, that the husband never texts ahead to let her know that he's going to be late for dinner. So what happens is she issues a complaint. He then comes back with a justification for the behavior that he did. The wife then doubles down on the complaint, perhaps attacking the justification, and so the husband feels a need to justify not only the behavior, but also the original justification. These are all examples of negative reciprocation patterns, and they change from topic to topic, and they will take on their own unique attributes from person to person or couple to couple. But the research is clear. If a couple falls into a pattern of significant use of these negative reciprocation patterns, both or one of the members of this marriage is likely to be dissatisfied with the marital relationship. Fortunately, there are positive reciprocation patterns as well. So, for example, a supportive remark and another supportive remark, or an agreement and another agreement, or a summarizing of someone's position followed by a summarizing of the other person's position, or, for example, a validating kind of remark and another validating kind of remark. Now, these are all examples of positive kinds of reciprocation patterns. And remember, all of these reciprocation patterns can occur anytime in a marriage, but when they occur in a conflict episode, When, for example, on Tuesday at 7 o'clock, the husband and wife are arguing about visiting the in-laws. That's when these negative or positive reciprocation patterns tend to have the most power. Or to put it differently, while these reciprocation patterns can occur at any time during a marriage, they are especially important to keep an eye on when people have conflict. Now, let me say a word here, not only about these reciprocation patterns, but about many other things we've already talked about. And it is this. A lot of the patterns that we're talking about with respect to conflict occur well before people actually get married. So if you imagine, for example, a guy and a girl begin dating at the senior year of college, they date for, let's say, 3 years, then get engaged and get married. By the time that marriage starts, they have a 3-year or so history between the two of them. In all likelihood, they've had conflict during those 3 years. And so during those conflicts prior to marriage, they begin to establish a pattern of, for example, falling into negative reciprocation patterns. Or they tend to have one or more views of conflict where they focus on, for example, emotions. And so it's important to understand that from the time a romantic relationship begins, whenever there's conflict, people begin to establish a pattern of how they're going to handle interpersonal conflict. And so reciprocations become one, but not the only, important dimension of conflict between husbands and wives. Another important dimension of marital conflict has to do with what are called attributions. Attributions are explanations for things. There's a researcher named Alan Sillars who has done much research into how attributions work in a marital context. Imagine, for example, this. It's very important to the wife that a clean bathroom be kept, but for whatever reason, the husband always seems to never be able to clean up after himself in the bathroom. So, for example, he doesn't flush the toilet, or he'll brush his teeth and leave toothpaste residue all over the sink. And so this frustrates the wife, and the two of them have conflict over it. So the conflict that most recently occurred between this husband and wife occurred when the wife walked into the bathroom and saw that the toilet had not been flushed, and the husband's clothes were laying on the floor rather than being put in the laundry hamper. So she marches into the bedroom and says to her husband, "How many times have we been over this? It's so important for you to pick up your clothes. And would you please flush the toilet? Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a 6-year-old. Just flush the toilet." Well, this touches off a conflict between the husband and the wife, where the husband tells the wife it's not a big deal, and she doesn't have to yell at him all the time, and maybe if she were a little more patient and understanding, she wouldn't have as much of a problem with the cleanliness of the bathroom. And after all, he's doing his best, but he's under a lot of pressure right now, and can't she just give him a break? It's a conflict. And actually, it's the kind of conflict that seems to be quite common among many marriages. Because individually, perhaps, leaving clothes on the floor is not a big deal, but the conflict that stems from that is a big deal. Well, what has this got to do with attributions? Well, the conflict over the stuff we've just talked about, from the wife's perspective, has to be explained somehow. Why did the husband leave the clothes on the floor in the bathroom? Why did he not flush the toilet? She has to make an attribution or has to make an explanation for that. And that explanation or attribution is going to play into whether there's a conflict or not and what she says that might lead to the conflict. In fact, it might even influence what she says in the middle of that conflict. So how do we make these attributions? Well, in Sillars' research, we make these attributions either globally or episodically. A global attribution is when you say things like, "My spouse always." So the wife says, "My husband is so irresponsible. He always leaves his clothes on the floor." And so now the leaving of the clothes on the floor or refusing to flush the toilet is a personality flaw. It's something wrong with the husband. It's a global kind of attribution as opposed to an episodic attribution. An episodic attribution focuses on one particular episode, and it says, well, in this instance, on this day at this time, my husband forgot to flush the toilet. Now, that still doesn't let him off the hook, and it still might lead to some kind of a conflict, but the episodic thing wants to separate that incident from how the spouse sees the husband in an overarching kind of perspective. So rather than saying, my husband is irresponsible, he forgot to flush the toilet, instead, the wife says, he forgot to flush the toilet. And then she goes to talk to him about it. She doesn't necessarily chalk that up to a personality flaw. Now, one of the things we know is that people that make consistently negative global attributions tend to find themselves in a less satisfying marriage. So the more often that the wife chalks up all of this bathroom stuff to her husband's irresponsibility or his lack of politeness or concern for her, the more likely she is to experience a dissatisfied marital relationship. If, on the other hand, she can episodically explain this stuff, then she's less likely to have a dissatisfying marital relationship. Now, let's go back to what's happening here. When the husband is yelled at by the wife for having left the toilet unflushed and the clothes on the floor, his explanation for this particular conflict is, well, he did those two things. His explanation is what Sillars calls a near proximate cause. So if we think about the conflict being right here, the closest thing to that conflict right here is the toilet not being flushed, the clothes on the floor of the bathroom. After all, when the wife saw those two things, that's when she marched into the bedroom to have the argument with him. The near proximate cause, the clothes on the floor, the toilet not flushed. But there's another way to look at this, that the conflict that occurred when the wife marched into the bedroom actually occurred well before all of those things were discovered. So, for example, it might be that the wife's emotions were already in a difficult state. If, in that previous example, the wife did have a bad day at work, if she had been yelled at by her supervisor and was deeply frustrated and angered over not getting the promotion, and she comes home and transfers those emotions, then in her mind, this conflict is not about the near cause. Instead, it's a distant proximate cause or a remote proximate cause. It's remote in the sense that what's really driving this conflict didn't occur in time immediately before the conflict, but instead was set in motion back here. In this particular illustration, it was set in motion when the wife is, in essence, taking out her anger on her husband. Now, that's not to say that the wife's complaints aren't legitimate. It's just to say that there's a way to see any conflict as either being brought about by a near cause or by a remote cause. Well, what's the point? Well, the point is that research finds that oftentimes husbands and wives exhibit a difference with respect to whether they tend to see a near proximate or a remote proximate cause of a conflict. Husbands are more likely to see a near proximate cause of a conflict. That is to say, they're more likely to say that a given conflict came into being because of some event that occurred directly before that conflict. Wives, on the other hand, females, are more likely to see a remote proximate cause. They're more likely to see this overall pattern of behavior that is manifest in this most recent incident. Now, the near proximate and the remote proximate and the global and episodic go together really very nicely. I said a moment ago that research finds that the more negative global attributions you make, the less satisfied you tend to be in your marriage. It probably shouldn't be a surprise to tell you that the more negative global attributions people make, the more likely they are to see remote proximate causes as being the root of conflict. That means it's especially difficult to overcome these kinds of global attributions that are being made. So the key, of course, is to try and practice good attributions. Or to put it differently, to try and get yourself to a point where you can see not global explanations, but episodic explanations. And get you to a point where you see not remote causes, but instead proximate causes. This allows you to focus specifically on that proximate cause and put your arms around something that's more manageable to try and talk about and perhaps change behavior. And so all of this is Sillars' way of saying that conflict doesn't just occur. It often occurs because of the explanations or the attributions we make for the kinds of things that give rise to conflict. Another communicative dimension that relates to marital conflict is what's known as repair attempts. If you think about it, whenever there's a conflict, it's possible for people to try and repair whatever damage that conflict is doing. It's also possible to think that after a conflict is over, there might also be a need for some kind of a repair attempt. There's a lot of research that finds that repair attempts, the lack of them or the more effective use of them, is correlated with the successful management of conflict between husbands and wives. Or to put it differently, those husbands and wives that have conflict are typically better managing that conflict if they're making use of effective repair techniques. If you're not making use of effective repair techniques, then chances are pretty good the conflict is not being well managed, and that in turn means the chances are pretty good of negative implications because of that conflict. So a repair attempt is an idiosyncratic kind of a thing. It's something that you might do individually to try and shore up the damage that has been done. So for example, there's some research that finds that an immediate apology is a very good repair attempt. Communicatively, an immediate apology not only makes someone feel validated, it not only makes people feel as if they've been heard, it also is an attempt to repair the disruption that has occurred to a relationship. Another communicative repair attempt is when people will try and change the emotional tone. They change the emotional tone, for example, by lowering the volume of their voice, or by speaking more slowly, or by talking in a way that eliminates a tone of condescension or a tone of sarcasm. Changing the emotional tone is something you can do either verbally or non-verbally, but it becomes a kind of repair attempt because it recognizes that the communicative aspects of this particular interaction have gotten out of hand and they need to be dialed back a bit. And so oftentimes these repair attempts that change the emotional tone can bring that about. Interestingly enough, there's some research that finds that even the posture of people involved in a conflict can act as a kind of repair attempt. So we know, for example, that arguments between husbands and wives tend to be more intense when both of them are standing. But if one of them sits in the midst of a standing argument, that tends to not only change the emotional tone, but it also tends to signal a turn in the conversation. It's almost like calling a kind of timeout, or it's like opening a door to handling the contact or conflict in a different way than it otherwise had been handled at that point. The upshot of all this is that repair attempts become really important when they are present in the midst of a conflict between a husband and a wife. They not only try and repair the immediate damage, they signal a kind of outreach, a kind of effort to try and change what has previously happened in this particular interaction. So back to our example about the husband and the wife in the bathroom. If the wife marches into the bedroom and proceeds to tell the husband what I said a moment ago, and the husband fires back with what he said a moment ago, a repair attempt might look like this. The husband might sit down and he might say, I don't want to fight about this. I will try and do better if you will try and give me a little bit of a break and allow me some opportunities to fail, because I'm not perfect and I will inevitably forget to flush the toilet. Because, I wasn't raised like that. I was raised with all brothers, and we just didn't flush the toilet, and I'm still getting the hang of this. That's a repair attempt. It is both an apology, and it's also a recognition of the validity of what the wife is saying. Also, because it's a lower tone of voice, because it has less stridency in the voice, non-verbally it sends the message that we're changing the direction of this conflict. Now, I've said previously that each couple and each individual idiosyncratically does a lot of this communicative dimension of interpersonal conflict. And it's especially true here in repair attempts. Research finds that people tend to have their go-to repair attempts. For some people, it's apology. For other people, it is changing the emotional tone. For other people, it's a change of topic to a less controversial kind of a topic. Regardless, you tend to have your own go-to strategy for repair attempts. The key is to figure out what your strategy is, what your spouse's strategy is, and to see how those strategies fit into the overarching tone and tenor of the marital relationship. And then the last of these dimensions of conflict that occurs between husbands and wives are what are called perpetual problems. Perpetual problems are those particular topics where a husband and a wife are simply never going to see eye to eye. There's always going to be a disagreement. So, for example, I know several couples where one of the two of them is a devout Christian who attends church all the time and wants to raise the kids in the Christian faith. They're deeply involved in church and are therefore out of the house a couple of nights a week involved in church-based activities. But yet the spouse is not a believer, or the spouse perhaps was once a Christian but now no longer is. And so that spouse who's a non-believer doesn't go to church, isn't necessarily hostile to it, but doesn't attend and has no desire to make church or Christianity a part of the spouse's life. Well, I've known some couples that are in that situation and quite frankly have been there for a number of years. It's a perpetual problem. What do you do with that? Well, research, frankly, suggests that that is not nearly as difficult a situation as you might think. You see, many individuals feel as if there is something like that, that's an indication that the marriage is in trouble. Some people feel that there shouldn't be anything like that whatsoever. That's the opposite of what the research shows. The research shows that, in fact, couples can have perpetual problems, and those perpetual problems do not have to be necessarily negative in the grand scheme of their marital relationship. Well, how can that be? Well, one explanation for that has to do with what researchers have called the necessity of harmony. The necessity of harmony is this idea that on a continuum, each individual lies somewhere on the continuum between we really have to make sure we agree on everything and we don't have to agree on much at all. Or to put it differently, each individual person has his or her own perspective on how much husbands and wives have to agree on stuff. If you have a high necessity for harmony, you believe that you and your spouse need to agree on most everything. And there can't be disagreements or differences of opinion or completely different ways of doing things. You want as much harmony or as much homogeneity as you possibly can muster. On the other hand, there are spouses who individually privilege the other end of that continuum. They recognize that you're not always going to agree on everything. And in fact, even on some rather major kinds of value considerations or religious or political considerations, there can be very significant differences. And that's okay. Your need for harmony oftentimes dictates the extent to which you become comfortable with these perpetual problems. So one of the first things you have to ask yourself is, where do I land on this continuum of the necessity of harmony? And similarly, where does my spouse land on the continuum of the necessity of harmony? As you might imagine, the research suggests that dissatisfaction in a marital relationship is most likely to occur when a husband and wife land in different places on this continuum. If, for example, one values harmony and the other does not, then that's likely to make perpetual problems more of a significantly negative consideration as they have conflict about that. On the other hand, if they tend to be matched at either end of the spectrum or land even in the middle somewhere close by, then chances are pretty good that those perpetual problems are not as likely to have as significant a problem. And so perpetual problems can be addressed in a number of ways, but the most common way of addressing perpetual problems is to avoid the conversations about them from escalating. It's almost like putting a cap or a ceiling on the possible escalation. So imagine, for example, it's Sunday morning and the spouse that is the devout Christian is getting the kids together to head out the door to church. So the spouse turns and says, "Hey, going to church, you know you're always welcome. Come along if you'd like." The spouse from the couch says, "Nah, it's okay. I'm good. You know that, but thanks for asking." So at that point in time, they've not allowed the conflict to escalate. They both know where they stand on the question of going to church, and so they simply raise it quickly, and then they choose not to de-escalate, or they choose not to escalate it. It's actually very similar to another family communication dynamic that's often found in Christian circles. Sometimes a set of Christian parents will raise their children in such a way that they're disappointed with one of the children because that child, as an adult, is not faithful to the Christian faith. And so they argue back and forth. Let's say that the mother and the adult child argue about whether the adult child is going to church or not. Well, as long as that adult child is not going to church, it's a perpetual problem. If the mom continues to badger and pester and criticize and poke at the child for not going to church, then that creates a kind of escalation of the problem. But if, on the other hand, the mom plays it cool, continues to occasionally invite the child to church, if the mom has let the child know where he or she stands on all this, and occasionally reiterates it, then the chances are that whenever they do talk about this, it's not going to escalate. Well, that dynamic has been found to be quite common in parent-adult-child relationships, and in a similar fashion between husbands and wives, that de-escalation dynamic has been found to be really helpful. Sadly, the research finds that husbands and wives have to get to a point where they can do the non-de-escalation thing. But the research does suggest you can get there. It takes a sense of will, or, to go back to what we talked about earlier, it takes this conscious choice, the kind of rationality that Kathleen Galvin talks about, for you to decide, I'm not going to push this. I'm not going to escalate this. Instead, I'm just going to let it ride. And so, As we wrap up this first session on conflict between husbands and wives, you can see that there are many dynamics that are a part of how conflict in a spousal setting occurs. In the next session, we'll talk specifically about the styles that spouses have and how that plays into interpersonal conflict. And then the subsequent session after that, we'll look at interpersonal conflict and how it occurs between parents and kids and how conflict might affect the kids in a broader context.